And this morning on the Ag Issues program, a pleasure as always to bring back to the program Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the program this morning. Roger, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Greg. Just fine, thanks.
Well, let's get right to it. We got a couple of pretty important topics to talk about, and one which has been somewhat in the works in different forms, different fashions, is animal ID, or in this case, we're talking about electronic animal identification, the mandate for the cattle industry. And you have a recent blog post about that. But as we mentioned, this is something that has been somewhat in the works, or versions have been in the works for quite some time.
Yeah, that's true, Greg. Actually, going back probably almost 30 years now, if we trace it back to when the U.S. entered the World Trade Organization at the beginning of 1995, I think we can see the genesis of this at that point. Of course, the purpose of the WTO, at least as it was expressed, was to increase imports and exports around the world. And when it was formed, there were recommendations made for nations to adopt animal ID procedures to track disease in animals as a means of facilitating trade. So that's how it was pitched at that time. The U.S. effort began really about 1999 and accelerated in 2002. And if you remember, back in 2002, we had a Canadian cow that was infected with BSE that got into the U.S. And in 2003, the USDA's APHIS, their Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, proposed the National Animal Identification System, the NAIS, which contained a mandatory registration of premises and exclusive use of electronic ID devices, or EID ear tags, on all classes of cattle from birth to slaughter by cattle farmers and ranchers. That proved to be really unpopular, particularly in the cattle industry, not so much in hogs and poultry. You had about 80% of hog farms that voluntarily participated, about 95% of poultry, but not in the cattle industry. There was only about 18% of cattle operations that voluntarily participated in the NAIS. And so Congress stopped funding it. And there was a 2010 USDA fact sheet that was put out that acknowledged that as they said, the vast majority of participants were highly critical of the NAIS. And so USDA then made some promises that they would take a new approach and offer more flexibility and lower cost options and come up with an approach that was supposed to be less burdensome.
Well, let's talk about the recent, developments on that, and that includes, back in early May, or earlier this month, as well, leading up to the new final rule that they ruled on as far as what they would like to see, or what the courts would like to see on the case there.
Yeah, Greg, I find this kind of funny in one respect. When I talk about tax legislation, we say something is permanent in the tax code. Well, it's only permanent until Congress changes it. We kind of get the same thing with animal ID and USDA coming up with a final rule. Well, a final rule in USDA lexicon is only final until they change their mind and change the rule and come up with another final rule, because that's what happened here. If you go back to 2010, USDA announced that it was abandoning the NAIS. They came up with a new final rule in 2013 regarding adult cattle that were shipped across state lines, and those cattle were to be affixed with official animal ID device. And that led to some challenges. In 2019, the USDA put out a fact sheet with another notice specifying that radio frequency ID, or RFID, was going to be the only option going forward. That was challenged in court successfully, and within 3 weeks of the lawsuit being filed, the USDA shelved the plan and asked the court to dismiss the case, which it did. And so that was 5 years ago, and that leads up to what's happened in 2024. And it was about 3 weeks ago, a little bit less than 3 weeks ago, the USDA published a new final rule that eliminated the flexibility and lower cost options and less burdensome requirements that were promised in the 2013 final rule. And so if this rule goes through, and there will be political and legal challenges to it, it will become effective November 5 this fall. And under that rule, adult cattle and bison that are shipped interstate must bear an EID ear tag, although cattle and bison that bear an official animal ID device under the 2013 final rule can keep that device through the animal's lifetime. But the new rule, Greg, effectively eliminates the flexibility that was to be given producers under the 2013 final rule to use lower cost ear tags that don't require premises registration.
Okay, 2 points to that. The cost has long been the issue as far as what the producers, or from the producers' point of view, I guess.
Yeah, and when you dig through the Federal Register, you can find the cost estimates that have been published in the Federal Register. And APHIS is now claiming that the cost of purchasing EID ear tags will be the only additional cost associated with the new mandate. And they've estimated the cost for producers to be about $26.1 million, which represents an average cost of just under $31 per cattle or bison operation each year. And that falls within the cost range estimates of the 2013 rule. And that's all published in the Federal Register. People can go check those numbers out. But when APHIS was responding to comments on the 2013 rule, that at least one study estimated the cost of an NAIAS type system would range as high as $1.9 billion. APHIS did not dispute that cost and did not dispute that study based on belief that APHIS's belief that management practices associated with those cost factors were not needed to comply with the 2013 rule. So as any time the government gets involved with this, they put out a cost estimate, you're going to have a wide range, and they almost always undershoot what the expense is going to be, whether it's this type of a system or some other type of a system. So who knows? But that's the cost estimate that's been published in the Federal Register. And
the mandate, as far as what the ruling was earlier in the month, does not increase the amount of cattle or the types of cattle or age of the cattle that are subject to the ear tags?
That's correct. In terms of the scope and classes of cattle that are covered, they say it will not increase the number of cattle subject to the EID ear tag mandate beyond the number of cattle that were already covered under the 2013 rule. The commentary in the Federal Register says the new rule says that, or the APHIS is saying that the new rule will cover 11 million cattle. Those are the ones that are going to be impacted by the mandate. And that's an estimate, APHIS, based on the number of official ID ear tags that have been used in previous years. Now, that represents only about 11 to 12% of U.S. cattle and bison inventory. It also does not change the type or class of animals subject to the EID ear tag mandate from those that were covered under the 2013 rule. And so what's covered would be all sexually intact cattle and bison 18 months of age or over, all female dairy cattle of any age, and all male dairy cattle born after March 11 of 2013, as well as cattle and bison of any age that is used for rodeo or recreational events, and cattle and bison of any age used for shows or exhibitions. Now, if they don't cross state lines, then you can't have the federal government have jurisdiction. And that's when we get to the cost issue, back to that issue, that means in a state such as Ohio, where there are no processing plants, there are no packing plants in Ohio, those cattle will have to cross state lines. And so they will have to have the additional cost of having these tags. Not so in cases such as Kansas, where there are processing plants, you don't have to have the cattle move across state lines. The federal, you can have a state-run system there, but the federal government would not have any jurisdiction unless there's an interstate commerce connection. And so if you're not crossing state lines, then you don't have that additional cost. So there's that discrepancy. I'm sure that's one challenge point that's going to be made with respect to this, because you have a disparate impact in terms of cost, depending on geographic location of the operation.
You know, throughout the time frame, clear back to the 2013 rule, APHIS acknowledged some shortcomings associated with the rule, or the rule back in 2013, but your point to that is only basically one of those points were addressed with the new rule?
Yeah, that's right. We still have a lot of shortcomings with respect to this rule, and APHIS did acknowledge and assert that its testing of the 2013's rule effectiveness showed that states on average could trace animals in less than an hour. In other words, at least in states where an animal is either shipped from or the state where the animal is officially identified. Now, despite that success, APHIS acknowledged that there were at least four shortcomings. And one, they said, well, you're going to have to tag about 70% of the cattle. They would have to be traceable for it to be fully prepared for a possible incursion of a foreign animal disease. Well, the new rule, as I said, doesn't require any additional cattle to be officially identified than are required under current regulations. So they're not going to satisfy that test. APHIS also acknowledged that the 2013 rule, in that rule, that the digitization of interstate certificates of veterinary inspections, or the ICVIs, which have to accompany cattle and bison shipped interstate, they said is important to increase administrative efficiencies and to support timely traceability. But with this new rule, they didn't require the digitization of those records, and so they're not going to satisfy that issue either. And then they also acknowledged that the ear tags on the animal and accompanying ICVIs and other paper documents work in tandem, and both are essential to the process of animal disease traceability. And they claim that both of those are interdependent tools to be in electronic form, and there's a significant advantage over non-EID tags and paper record systems. So those are the deficiencies that are out there. And the last one in particular, this mandate only applies to producers, not the veterinary community. And so that would appear, I think, to jeopardize the ability of APHIS to get a significant advantage in tracing back diseased cattle. Well, they said that the justification for not requiring the digitization of the ICIVs is that they would be impracticable for the regulated community, but they didn't give any reason that the mandate would be impracticable. So there are flaws. The APHIS recognizes the shortcomings, and those are the major ones.
Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, is our guest this morning. And we had been talking about electronic animal identification mandates. Now let's switch over to what we finally had seen last week, and that, of course, is a farm bill, in this case the House version of the farm bill, being up for markup in the Ag Committee. That was marked up last Thursday and passed the House Ag Committee by a vote of 33 to 21. And just a reminder to people, Roger, the farm bill expired at the end of September of last year and extended for a year itself. So let's take a look. Let's break down some of the things we see on the House version of the farm bill. And first thing right out of the chute is the changes in the ARC and PLC reference prices.
Yeah, in the commodity title of the chairman's mark on the House, you've got a 10 to 20% increase on the statutory reference price for all of the covered commodities based on an analysis of the average annual increase in per unit cost of production since reference prices were established back in 2014 under the Farm Bill then. And so when you increase the statutory reference price, then the maximum effective reference price is also increased. And so those go up, and the ARC guarantee increases to 90% of benchmark revenue. That's up from 86%. And the maximum payment rate from ARC IC and ARC CO goes to 12.5% of benchmark revenue. So you do get to keep your annual election between ARC and PLC under the House version here, and they're trying also to streamline the administration of payment limitations for certain entities like LLCs and S-corps, and provide for an inflation-adjusted limitation if an operation gets at least 3/4 or more of its income from farming, ranching, or forestry. So those are the big points under the commodity title.
Another part of this is the repurposing of funds. You had heard, or for during this time the term climate smart ag practices. They had repurposed those funds to a broader range of conservation programs.
Yeah, and that's not going to sit well with the Senate, I can imagine. And of course, you only had 4 Democrats that supported this in the House Ag Committee, and they're going to have a lot more support on the other side of the aisle to get it through the Senate. But this is one that the Senate probably will not go along with, because the House removed the Inflation Reduction Act's climate sideboards to restore the locality-led nature of conservation programs, as they say here. So the more common type conservation programs, the more broad type conservation programs we've been used to for many, many years, particularly coming out of the 1985 Farm Bill. The House is saying, well, let's fund all of those. Let's not just worry about these so-called climate smart agricultural practices and fund those. So they're going to they propose to take the money out of the Inflation Reduction Act that was devoted to those climate smart practices in agriculture and fund conservation practices more broadly. I don't think the Senate will go along with that, and that could end up sinking the whole thing.
Another part of the chairman's mark on the House version of the Farm Bill is increasing funding for the market access programs, or MAP programs, and the foreign market development programs.
Yeah, this is Title III, which is the trade title of the House markup, and what it would do is double the funding to those programs. And I think there is bipartisan consensus on that, in recognizing the need for greater market access and trade promotion. So I don't think that one's going to be contentious, but that's in the House version.
Another part of this, too, is increasing loan limits for various FSA loans.
Yeah, this is Title V. This is the credit title of the bill, and it does increase the loan limits for guaranteed operating loans to $3 million. That's indexed to the CPI. The ownership loans, $3.5 million. That's indexed to land values. Direct operating loans go to $750,000. Direct ownership loans, $850,000. The micro loans, $100,000. Those are the big ones out there, and plus it provides additional resources to what they define as a new, young, or beginning and veteran farmer in their transition to farming and ranching. So different changes on the credit side of things.
Many of the commodity groups talked about don't change crop insurance, but there are some minor changes to the crop insurance side of this.
Yeah, just a little bit. It expands the premium subsidy support for beginning farmers and ranchers and the premium support for the supplemental coverage option to 80%. And it provides access to all commodities to a policy similar to the stacked income protection plan in cotton, while you also keep the price loss coverage.
And it's something that Republicans have wanted to see since this was implemented, in this case on the chairman's mark, is overturning last year's Supreme Court opinion on California's Proposition 12.
Yeah, this has been around for over a decade. There have been attempts on the House side to put provision in the Farm Bill, including the 2014 Farm Bill, that would prevent a state from making rules for production of agricultural products that apply in other states, which is what we saw happen with the SCOTUS opinion last year involving pork production and what California's Proposition 12 was doing. And so there's a provision here. There may be enough support on the Senate side to have that provision also. I think Senator Stabenow has already put that in the Senate version. But, Greg, we may end up with another extension. The comments made on the Senate side about what the House has done does not look very promising. Of course, the major part of funding is with respect to the SNAP payments of the nutrition title. There are major disagreements about that. It's quite plausible that we just get into September and they can't get this thing done and we get another extension for a year.
All right. Not the news that everyone wanted to hear, but I think a very stark reality of what we may see here the rest of the year, too.
Yeah, it is. And I know Stabenow wants to retire, and she's kind of wanting this to be the thing that she goes out with, but she's also said that she doesn't want a bill that she's not going to agree with. So that's why I'm thinking there's probably a 50-50 shot that this thing gets extended for another year.
All right. And by the way, for what we talked about earlier on electronic ID, they can find that in your blog?
Yep, I posted that last week, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR on my homepage and also over on the Ag Manager site at K-State.
All right, sounds good. Roger, as always, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the Ag Issues program here on 580 WIBW.